All right, welcome everyone to the final session of Lightning's talks. This one focusing on data collection, sharing, and reuse. First up, we have Kylie Hunter.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks everyone for hanging around for the last session. Hopefully we'll make it worth your while. So I'm going to introduce a framework for secondary use of clinical trials data in health research. So as we know, clinical trials represent a huge investment of public funding, researcher time, and participant trust. And this generates data, which are really valuable. But often these data, the results are published or reported, and then they're forgotten about. But with a move towards open science and more data sharing, we're now able to access and reuse these data for secondary research to make sure we maximize their utility. So the Health Studies Australian National Data Asset, or HASUNDA program, by ARDC, developed a national infrastructure platform to enable researchers to share and access data for secondary research. And they approached us at the University of Sydney seeking guidance on how these data may be used for secondary research. So was born the Science Scenarios Project with the objective to develop a theoretical framework for the use of clinical trials data for secondary research. So the methods we used to develop this, we drew on previous experience of the team and research literature. We consulted with several key stakeholders, and last year at AIMOS, some of you may have been part of our discussion group, so thank you for your contributions, if you were. So the framework we came up with for types of secondary research using clinical trials data has 4 key scenarios: evidence synthesis, secondary analyses, reproducibility, replication and validation, and education and methods development. These have all been compiled into this practical guide handbook, which is publicly available. And for each scenario, there's a step-by-step user guide, how to conduct these types of secondary research, the advantages and considerations of conducting these resourcing requirements, but also some illustrative case studies. So just briefly, evidence synthesis, that's bringing together data, so comprehensive compilation of data to answer specific research questions. So a meta-analysis of summary aggregate data or individual participant data. And an example of this is the ICOM study, which brought together 54 trials of almost 7,000 babies to address the question of the optimal management of the cord in preterm birth, and found that the reduced death by about 30% with high certainty evidence. So that's an example of how the IPD meta-analysis can be really impactful. This informed guidelines and practice. Secondary analysis is the second scenario. So this is things like using existing data sets to answer new research questions. So descriptive analyses, health economic assessments, prognostic predictive analyses, power calculations for future trials, and exploratory and hypothesis testing studies. And this example here went on to, maybe I won't speak to that one in the interest of time. And this one probably all are on board with: reproducibility, replication, and validation studies. I always like to quote the philosopher Karl Popper: single occurrences that cannot be reproduced are of no significance to science. So these studies aim to verify the accuracy, validity, and trustworthiness of scientific findings. So reproducibility, I don't think I need to go through each of these. I think most people are familiar with them: reproducibility, replication, and validation studies. And last but not least, education and methods development. So using existing data sets to teach or learn about data cleaning and analysis methods. But also we can use the data sets to develop and demonstrate new statistical methods, and also to inform machine learning and artificial intelligence. There you go. So once again, if you're interested in finding out more, check out the handbook. I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors, some of whom were here on Tuesday, but couldn't make it today. And thank you.
Hi everyone, so my name is Michelle and I'll be presenting research adherence to journal data sharing policies. So we all know that data sharing remains important for improving research value, so across the integrity of primary findings and align the conduction of secondary analyses. But despite these known benefits and high in-principle support, researcher intentions to share data rarely align with best practice. So we've aimed to investigate researcher adherence to journal data sharing policies across health research, including factors that increase data sharing intention and journal policy impact on execution, which could facilitate guidance for data sharing operationalization, including documents, timeframes, recipients, purpose, and mechanisms. So we conducted a cross-sectional analysis of original research published in 2022 in high-impact medical journals that specified the requirement or recommendation of sharing data. Manual collection of multiple characteristics was undertaken. So firstly, we undertook study characteristics, including study type, industry involvement, and COVID-19 relevance. Secondly, initial data sharing plans, including publicly available research protocol, initial data sharing statement, and intention. And lastly, final data sharing plans, including final data sharing statement and intention was descriptively analyzed. Now, within these final data sharing plans, further variables such as type of shared data, who it was shared with in comparison with initial plan was also specified alongside the prevalence of reasons as why investigators did not share individual participant data as per published data sharing statement. We assessed 22,007 articles across 134 journals, 27% of which requiring data sharing, while 73% merely recommended. And separate to journal data sharing policy was the explicit requirement of data sharing statements, where 63% required, 30% recommended, 6% mentioned, and 1% had none. Our study types were then characterized into interventional, observational, and other, which included animal studies, imaging, basic science, and laboratory-based research. However, within journals that recommended or required data sharing, approximately only half of interventional and observational studies actually intended to share data, as based off final data sharing intention, therefore demonstrating these reduced compliance rates. Several factors increase these intentions, specifically within interventional studies, such as industry involvement and COVID-19 relevance. So most notably, journal policies that required data sharing had a 19% absolute increase in both interventional and observational studies that intended to share data compared to those which only recommended. Furthermore, an absolute 16% increase in studies occurred that changed from not sharing data in their initial data intention to sharing data within their final, which supports the notion that journals should require data sharing for published articles due to this increase in compliance. And increased policy specificity also supports this, where of the two journals that specifically recommended data sharing from COVID-19 studies, 63% of COVID-19 studies ultimately intended to share data compared to 41% in journals which did not. And these associations were similarly seen within data statement policy mandating, which also supports the requirement of both types of policies. But data sharing mandating not only increases data sharing intention, but also is linked to more extensive data sharing practices. Journals are more likely to share all collected data immediately post-publication with broadened extent and purposes alongside unrestricted access. For the main reasons for not sharing data, the perception of sharing aggregate data was most common, which reflects a key misunderstanding of the reasons of why individual participant data is important, where sufficient level of analysis just can't be conducted with the extent of sharing. No reason was stated as the second most common, encompassing a lack of justification for researchers not sharing. So in conclusion, journals should clarify and define concepts while improving the review process for data sharing statements and evaluate the validity of reasons provided for non-disclosure. And these actions combined could assist in improving data sharing.
Thank you so much. This is the way the conference ends, not with a bang, but with a whimper. And thanks to those of you who also laughed at that joke at lunch. I recycled it. Before I start, I'd really like to thank Adrian and the organizing committee and all of the session chairs. I've had such an awesome time at this conference. I've met so many cool people and had a lot of exciting discussions. So looking forward to coming back next year. And yeah, today I'm going to be talking about some work with my collaborators at CSIRO. So hi, my name's Owen. I'm a statistician. I work at CSIRO. And this work is in collaboration with my supervisors, Pete Thrall, Andrew Young, and Cheng Su Nong from Data 61. And we're talking about taking steps towards a quantitative organizing framework for thinking about research prioritization, thinking about these dimensions of impact, urgency, effort, and complexity,
how we can try and choose projects with a good impact to effort ratio and stay out of the enticing bullshit zone. So I think that we can see that across a variety of fields, we've got accelerating crises which are demanding our attention. We've got limited resources and dwindling time in which to address them. And I think it's obvious that we as the research community need to think really carefully about aiming ourselves at the right problems. So the motivating question that I'm thinking about in this talk is how can we strategically invest our time, our energy, and our resources in a way that we can optimize this ratio of impact to effort in our research? There are some tools available in related fields. So for instance, looking at Bayesian decision theory and optimal or adaptive design, tools like value of information and related approaches. And what I'll try and make the argument to you today is that if we have a nice formal quantitative framework to try and grapple with these questions, it can enable us to do better decision making and think about resource allocation at multiple and larger scales. A challenge that needs to be discussed to kind of get any handle in this domain is agreeing upon and then thinking about how to quantify dimensions relating to research projects and research problems. So we've proposed these labels of impact, urgency, effort, and complexity. And there's related approaches across various disciplines. So for instance, you look at business and management literature, they've got the RICE framework, which is like reach, impact, confidence, and effort. Relatedly, in health economics, you can look at things like dollars per quality adjusted life year from a given intervention. And as I mentioned, Bayesian decision theory, optimal design. And one of the things that I think is valuable is that you can think about applying this framework at different scales. So as an individual researcher, you can think about triaging and choosing between candidate projects that you're considering. As an organization, you can think about things like resource allocation and sampling design. And if someone wants to ask me a leading question, I'll talk about an example in ecology later. But I won't, because for the sake of trying to keep to 5-ish minutes. And also at the discipline level. So I'll talk a little bit about some cool use cases for this sort of thinking at a discipline scale. Some questions that I think are interesting to consider are, what are the trajectories that past research initiatives have taken to successfully end up working on solutions in a high impact, high effort zone, solving hard problems? And what are the attributes of projects that have successfully ended up addressing big challenges? So this picture's cut off. It's impact and effort, effort and complexity along the bottom dimension. And we know that there's a lot of big important challenges that demand our attention that are in that high impact, high urgency, high effort, high complexity quadrant. And so then what is the trajectory that research projects follow to navigate through that space? And I think that if we had quantitative measures of these dimensions, you could actually start to formally interrogate that question with like time series trajectory models, for instance. So a blue trajectory here being something like blue sky research, going from something that's initially complex and novel and ending up being applied in an impactful way. And maybe a green trajectory being something more translational. So taking an idea that we know works and then applying it to an important problem. I think this also relates to the idea that how we should allocate resources depends on how well explored our research domain is. So in fresher, kind of newer disciplines, there's a lot of opportunities for blue sky research projects that are complex and interesting in their own right to end up hitting on interesting ideas and becoming impactful and useful. But the more saturated a research domain gets, the smaller that target gets for blue sky research. And here comes the enticing bullshit zone, which I've provocatively titled. I think, you know, that you don't want to end up chasing down a rabbit warren of questions that are interesting because they're complex, but not necessarily because they're useful. So the distilled message I'd like to leave you with is that I think it's a luxury and a privilege to be a scientist. And for a lot of the important problems that demand our attention, time is really a luxury we can't afford. So I think that our scientific capabilities, they carry with them a moral imperative to use systematic approaches to identify and pursue the most impactful priorities. So if you think this idea has legs, which I think it does, I'm interested to open up the conversation. What do you think about these dimensions? Are they useful things to be focusing on? Are there useful measures within each of those dimensions? And how could we start to get a handle on plausible quantitative measures that could reach some level of consensus? And I'm conscious I've only got 5 minutes and I've gone over time, but you know, please come chat with me about it. I'm really keen to start a conversation and start taking some steps in the direction of a framework where we can use formal tools and Bayesian decision theoretic approaches to kind of do that in a systematic way. Yeah, thanks for your attention.